Through the Bible, God has much to say to us about the urgency of the moment. There are encouragements to be alert, there are calls to boldness and to action, and we find such instructions delivered to Esther when she is to stand up for the Jewish people who are in captivity. This is what we read about the encouragement to her. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Christians tend to embrace these calls to action. Have you ever been to a youth rally or a major multi-church event? There are so many appeals and calls to action. There are so many appeals to urgently act on different initiatives and different things. You can just feel the enthusiasm rise to the rafters of the building. And so the Bible does call us to action. We are to actively live out our faith in Jesus Christ. But the Bible also has a number of calls for us to wait. Sometimes it seems like the Bible has more to say about waiting than it does to say about being active or taking action. And we find some of these instructions in places like the Psalms. In Psalm 27, we read, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord." The calls to wait on the Lord are a major theme in the Hebrew Scriptures. And we see that same theme picked up by Jesus when he calls us to be patient and to trust in God's provision. And we see those same calls to us by the Apostle Paul and the early church leaders when they tell the people of God to be patient with one another and to be faithful. In Exodus 32, we find a people that are completely unable to wait, and their inability to wait led them away from God and into something much darker. So Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and Moses is getting instructions from the Lord about how God is to interact with his people. He's getting all the instructions about the covenant that God is to have with the people of Israel. And while Moses is up there getting these very specific instructions about how God and Israel are to interact with one another, the people are at the base of Mount Sinai, and the people are waiting, and they are getting exceptionally restless. Even though Moses at this moment is up on Mount Sinai getting those exact instructions about how these people are supposed to relate to God, they are restless, and they turn to Aaron. This is what they ask of Aaron. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Waiting is hard. When nothing is happening, there's always the temptation to do something. There's a temptation to do just absolutely anything. We want everything now. We don't want it correctly. We don't want it in the proper way. We just want it now. It's why we immediately demand election results the minute we vote. It's why we can't even wait those 30 seconds after the pizza's been in the microwave and we try to eat it right away when it's piping hot. We just can't wait for anything. And the Israelites are no different. Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. When the Israelites left Egypt, the Egyptians gave them an incredible amount of supplies and sent them on their way. This is what we read in Exodus 12 about what the Israelites were given by the Egyptians when they left Egypt. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, "We will all die." So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people and gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The gold that they're using for this golden calf is the gold that they were given when they left Egypt. They were now taking reminders of what God had done for them and turning them into something far less. They were taking the plunder given to them from Egypt and putting it towards something other than God. This jewelry is precious, and it's not just precious because it's gold and because it's valuable. This is precious because this is a reminder that God was faithful to them and God brought them through this exceptionally difficult circumstance and did so with great blessing. Aaron took what they handed to him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. The gold is fashioned into an image, and that image is then worshiped. It becomes the center for this great riotous revelry that takes place by the people of Israel, taking place at the base of the mountain. At the base of the very mountain where God is giving the instructions to Moses about how God is to be engaged and how God is to have a covenant with them and how God is to be worshipped. And so it becomes this riotous thing that resembles the worship that other nations and other places and other tribes have towards their own gods. And this is not how God is to be worshiped. This is not how God is to be engaged. And so this is the result. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you, Moses, into a great nation." Moses is upset. God is upset. The entire rescue mission that God had in bringing the Israelites out of Egypt is in jeopardy. As I was preparing this sermon, I came across an idea that I hadn't encountered before, and it was asking about who it was that the Israelites were trying to worship in worshiping this golden calf. Now, I was very used to the idea of the golden calf just being an idol, like being some different kind of God that the Israelites either encountered somewhere or just had come out of the Israelites and Aaron's collective brain and been formed into this idol and then been worshipped. So my idea was that this was an idol to a false god. But what if this isn't an idol to a false god? What if instead this is a horrible attempt to worship the God, and the people just either don't fully understand who God is and how God is different, and so they worship him in this way? Or is this actually the worshiping of other gods? Well, there's some dispute about the word that we have been reading so far that's been translated as gods. It can also be translated as God, singular. And so instead of the Israelites asking for Aaron to make them gods that will go before them, they may be asking, "Come make a god who will go before us." And further, he took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "This is your God, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." So is this the worshiping of false gods and idols, or is this an attempt to worship God without proper understanding or proper practice of doing so? So the question we ask, were the Israelites building and worshiping false gods, or were the Israelites trying to worship the God in an odd sort of way? Is this a blatant act of rejecting God, or is it something else? Or is this an attempt to worship God, the true God, in a way that is exceptionally poorly done? Well, it doesn't really matter, because either they're giving up their God who saved them for something phony, or they are treating God like any other nation treats their own gods. Everything about God's actions with Israel in Egypt screamed that this God was different than anything else that anyone had ever encountered before. When God delivers the Israelites, he systematically destroys any hint of the mighty gods of Egypt. God establishes himself as the God that is far above any other gods. So when the Israelites demand Aaron make them this lustrous golden calf and this lustrous image out of gold that they had from God delivering them, They are acting as if the God that they are to worship and to follow can be worshiped just like any other God that's out there, any other deity that's lesser and that they've encountered or seen other nations worship. But God will not have it. God is not like these lesser gods and will not be treated in the same way. So Moses is bothered by what the Israelites have done. The Lord is bothered by what they have done. And to God, this is seen as an absolute rejection of him and his ways. But God does not abandon his people who refuse to wait on him. The Lord replied to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. Now go, lead the people to the place I spoke of, and my angel will go before you." God has been betrayed, but God's faithful presence endures. God's faithful presence will still go before them as they travel around in the wilderness. However, God goes on, when the time comes for me to punish, I will punish them for their sin. And we heard earlier, as we read this passage of Exodus 32, the devastating and deadly consequences that took place because of their sin. The Lord struck down the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. There is still a consequence. Moses goes up to Sinai to sort out exactly what the relationship between God and the people of Israel is going to look like. But the people cannot wait for those instructions and for that information. They cannot just sit and wait and be patient. They demand that something be done. There is an emptiness inside them that they know must be filled, but instead of waiting for God to be the one to fill that emptiness, they act out. They make something happen even though they should have just waited. They force Aaron into actions that he should have never done, and their haste has very bitter consequences. What they felt as urgent did not require an urgent response. What they felt as urgent instead required waiting and required patience. So when we look at our own lives, how do we know when something is genuinely urgent, like urgent in a way that requires some action of us? And when do we know that there's a situation where we just have to wait? Well, when it comes to urgency, I think a lot of times things that are life and death are things that require an urgent response for us. Things like our health, things like safety, things that are time sensitive that need to be dealt with or else there'll be major consequences for us. Those are all the kinds of things that require urgency in our lives. And also sometimes we require a little more urgency in our lives when we find ourselves being complacent or when we find ourselves being lazy. I can look back at my life and see several times where I had a complacent attitude about things and I let really good opportunities that came my way pass me by. And that was a time when I really could have used some urgency in my life. But most other times in my life, urgency isn't something that I need. I need to wait instead when I am trying to force things to happen. There's been a lot of times where I tried to make something happen by manipulating the people around me or by manipulating different circumstances, and I try to make something happen when nothing is going on. And that is a real misplaced sense of urgency. It's a bad sense of urgency to be in. I have made some big mistakes in my life because I felt the need to make something happen. And so when I try to force things in a certain way, I know I'm not acting out of a sense of the patience that God is calling me to have. And instead, I'm having a sense of urgency that's probably going to have some destructive results. Instead of waiting on God in my restlessness, I'm doing my very best to build golden calves. I'm forcing and sculpting something in my life that doesn't actually work, instead of patiently waiting for something better from God and something that God wants to genuinely do in my life. Not every decision that we make is an urgent decision. Not everything that comes our way requires extreme urgency from us. But almost every situation in our lives requires us to be patient and requires us to wait on the Lord. We wait restlessly, but we trust that the God who's delivered us before will deliver us again. Now, I'd like to thank you for staying with me so far in this sermon, because I think for some of you listening to this, you're thinking, hey, Mark, thanks for nothing. because you have been waiting on something for a very long time, or you've been in a place where you have been stuck for a very long time. And sometimes that's been weeks, sometimes that's been months, sometimes that's been years, sometimes that has been decades. And you are just sick to death of waiting. You've tried taking control of this situation and you've yielded zero results. You've tried the whole let go and let God approach, and that has yielded zero results. And so you are very frustrated and you are very tired, and your faith is worn very thin. One of the things about waiting is that at the time, waiting never makes sense. There's almost never a time when we are waiting on something and it makes sense for us to be patient and wait. It makes sense for some action to happen for us or some relief to take place, but it almost never makes sense when we wait. Waiting for Moses and God made zero sense for the Israelites who were stranded in the wilderness. Again, we read the passage that says, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." We too, like the Israelites, end up in this confusing space waiting. But God is faithful. And sometimes this is all that we can hold on to, this belief that God is faithful, and we continue to wait. Even if we take that reckless path that the Israelites took of unnecessary action and unbelief, time and time again, people have found that on the other side of that, God is still faithful. The point is not your faithfulness or your lack of faithfulness. The point in the end is that God will prove himself to be faithful. And so we wait. We wait restlessly. We wait anxiously. Sometimes we wait patiently, but more often we wait in a very unsatisfied and painful way. But God is faithful. When God wanted to incinerate the whole lot of Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai, Moses persuaded God not to do this, and he did this by reminding God of God's own faithful character. He says, "Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever." I don't know that God actually needed this reminder. I don't think he really did. But when Moses appeals to God's anger, he does so by appealing to God's basic character of faithfulness. And it's this basic character of faithfulness that we can rely on. We look to this faithful God. We hold on to this faithful God. We hope in this faithful God. And even when everything around us tempts us to believe that God has abandoned us, we instead hold on to a God that we believe is faithful. And even when we fail miserably at things, we hold on to a God that we believe as faithful. Now, at this point, I wanted to say, encourage one another that God is faithful, but sometimes that's not helpful, right? If someone's going through something difficult and you come with a cheery story about how faithful God's been in your own life, it doesn't always help. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't always help because the other person's left thinking, okay, that's great for you, but what about me right here? And so instead of encouraging people with God's faithfulness as giving them a reminder, sometimes we remind people of God's faithfulness by simply being with us, because that's how God is faithful with us too. God is present with us in every circumstance we are in. And so to remind one another of God's faithfulness, we simply be present with one another in whatever situation we are in. And that goes an incredibly long way. Let's trust in this faithful God together. Let's hope in this faithful God together. And let us remember always that God is with us. Amen.